Breaking news to tell you about in the last few minutes. Donald Trump adding another former television personality, it's a theme here, to his new administration, nominating Dr. Oz to serve as the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services Administrator. That's a position that manages Medicare and Medicaid and other programs that cover half of all Americans, half of all the people in this country. It's a position under the Department of Health and Human Services that will require Senate approval to be confirmed. Trump says Dr. Oz, who ran and lost the Senate Pennsylvania race in 2022 to John Fetterman, will work closely with RFK Jr. to, quote, take on the illness industrial complex and all the horrible chronic diseases left in its wake. Trump says this about Dr. Oz, quote, there may be no physician more qualified and capable to make America healthy again. Dr. Oz, of course, has no experience in government. Joining our coverage is Puck chief political columnist and MSNBC national affairs analyst John Heilemann. Also joining us, MSNBC contributor and columnist Charlie Sykes is here. Maya is still with us. John Heilemann, president gets to pick whomever he or she wants in their cabinet. And this president has been very attracted to television figures.
Well, I mean, Nicole, least surprising thing in the world that Donald Trump be attracted to television figures. That's all he is himself, is a television figure. Also, our next president of the United States. I have to say that in the spectrum, I don't want to dismiss any of these nominees, dismiss the importance of them. This is an important public health. This is an important job that relates to health care. And at least it is true that Dr. Oz is a doctor. And I don't want to try to define deviancy down here. But I will say that, if he had nominated Dr. Oz to be the head of Health and Human Services, I think we all would have breathed a sigh of relief, at least if the alternative was Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who has no relationship to public health whatsoever. And I think you would have said what you just said a second ago, which is the president gets to pick the people they get to pick, that they want to pick. That's their prerogative. But I have to say that when you hear that quote, which is that, the two biggest jobs in terms of health care policy and healthcare administration in the country now are going to be run, if Donald Trump gets his way, by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Dr. Oz. That is not something that anyone who has any relationship to the healthcare system is going to greet with a whole lot of enthusiasm, I would think, if they are in their right mind.
Charlie Sykes, there's something about the two planes on which we have to examine these, right? There is the intention from the Trump side, which is to throw shiny, round-shaped grenades into the news cycle. But there's a political reality. There are no agencies that touch more people and have more political power if they get screwed up than Medicare and Medicaid. None. There are no two programs that have the potential to turn red state governors against you if they get screwed up. There are no agencies that have the ability to turn old voters against you if they get screwed up. There are no agencies that have the potential to create a homelessness crisis anywhere in the country if they get screwed up. There are no agencies that have, a president's fate in their hands politically like these two if they get screwed up. And they are now in the hands of RFK Jr. and Dr. Oz.
Yeah, can we just start with that sentence? As soon as John said it, if we would have said a couple of months ago that the healthcare system in America would be, that these two agencies would be run by RFK Jr. and Dr. Oz, and that Tulsi Gabbard would be at the top of the intelligence committee and Matt Gaetz would be Attorney General, people would have said, oh, you guys are suffering from Trump derangement syndrome. Stop making this stuff up. Look, competence is obviously not a priority in these choices. And John is absolutely right. It is remarkable to the degree to which this administration has, in fact, defined deviancy down and defined absurdity down, because you put it all in context, and you have people who are utterly unsuited for the jobs they are being given and have a long history of comments and behavior that ought to be utterly disqualifying. During the COVID pandemic, Dr. Oz was a peddler of pseudoscience and disinformation, and now he's going to be running Medicare and Medicaid. And we don't even need to get into the things that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has done. So this administration is being staffed with reality TV stars, and what the consequences are, we don't know. I think that one thing that I would want to flag is we shouldn't take the focus off the people at the second and third tiers who will actually be doing the work that these figureheads are in fact supposed to be doing, because many of them will have agendas that frankly I am not sure that the majority of Americans even guessed at before the election, including the privatization of Medicare, the dismantling of many of the medical safety nets that we have in this country. So again, we're seeing more of the same that we've seen for the last week and a half.
Charlie, you tapped on something interesting, because if you talk to a Trump voter, they talk about Trump like he's some a la carte menu. Like, why? I didn't want the retribution piece. I just wanted the white hot economy. Right. Or, I don't like Matt Gaetz. I didn't want him. Or, I wasn't an RFK person. And wasn't he going to talk to Kamala Harris if she'd picked up? The point is, you get all of it. The point about Trump is that it's a package deal, and you get Trump, and you get Matt Gaetz, and you get J.D. Vance, and you get Project 2025, and you get RFK Jr. The thing that's interesting, though, about that, and every reporter out talking to Trump voters will say the same thing, is therein lies the political tension. And I think a lot of people have been looking for where is the tension going to be? And the tension is going to be within his own base about things that they don't think they signed up for. And they didn't sign up, I don't think they think, for Medicare to be messed with. I mean, what are the sort of liabilities with some of these selections?
Well, they're huge, and Donald Trump actually does understand this, or at least did at one time. I mean, one of his major political initiatives back in 2016 was when he separated himself from other Republicans. He said, "I will not mess with Social Security and Medicare." You remember when he did that? And that was crucial, I think, to putting together the coalition that he put together. You and I are old enough to remember the Tea Party. One of the great paradoxes of the Tea Party movement was people wanted to dismantle the government, slow down the growth of government, but they also supported Social Security and Medicare. So there is a real risk there. And as usual with Donald Trump, I think that you should not assume that he's thought through all of the consequences of messing with Medicare.
Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Even if Matt Gaetz was not investigated by the Department of Justice for the crime of sex trafficking a minor, something he says he did not do, something he's never been charged for, he still has no business being Attorney General. So let's just put all that aside for a moment, okay? For all the talk of qualifications and merit, for all the railing against DEI and affirmative action, Gaetz is the world's most ludicrous affirmative action pick ever. In this case, affirmative action for Trump toadies and attention-addicted trolls. The former Florida congressman is technically a lawyer, but barely. He practiced law at a small firm for a real minute until 2010 when he ran for office. And for context here, this was just 2 years after he passed the bar. He has no experience at any level of trial courts, not as a public defender or a prosecutor. He's got no experience working for the Department of Justice or any justice organization. In fact, he even had his law license suspended a few years ago because he was not paying his fees. At the time, his communications director said that is because Congressman Gaetz is no longer actively engaged in the practice of law. It appears as though he does indeed have his license back, so kudos there. But that alone, I'm just going to go and say it, is not qualification to be the top law enforcement officer in the country. So again, just starting there, manifestly unqualified, probably the most unqualified in the modern era. But then, of course, there is the pesky fact of those allegations about his conduct with a minor. Again, Gaetz says it's not true. We know the House Ethics Committee is sitting on what is apparently a pretty damning report into the matter. One attorney told NBC News his client testified before that committee, again, a bipartisan ethics committee. This was not a liberal witch hunt, okay? Bipartisan, Republicans, Democrats getting together, right? Testified before that committee that she witnessed Gaetz having sex with a minor at a 2017 party.
What did your client witness at this party?
She was walking outside to the pool, and she observed to her right her friend, who was 17 at the time, having sex with Representative Gates.
Did your client believe that Gates at the time knew that her friend was underage?
Yeah, so the House was curious about that. She testified that her belief was that Representative Gates had no knowledge that she was under 18, that she was 17 years old at the time he was having sex with her. She also testified that when Representative Gates found out that she was underage, that they stopped their sexual relationship and did not resume it until after she turned 18.
Leopard says his clients, both the alleged witness and another woman, testified Gates paid them repeatedly for sex and drugs.
Washington Post also reports, citing the same attorney, the women were paid through Venmo or other conduits, including the PayPal of, who else? Nestor Galban, whom Gates has referred to as his adopted son. Now, when NBC News first reported this story last Friday, a Gates spokesperson noted, quote, Merrick Garland's DOJ cleared Matt Gates and didn't charge him. But it's important to note that while Gates was not charged with DOJ, and that is true, and that they did look into these charges, that's not the same thing as being cleared. Now, despite all this, or really, who knows, maybe because of it, Donald Trump is standing by his man.
Mr. President, are you reconsidering the nomination of Matt Gaetz?
No.
How far are you willing to go to get him confirmed?
I think the answer to that last question is he's willing to go pretty far. Trump is even personally whipping votes behind the scenes. For example, here's what Republican Senator Kevin Cramer of North Dakota said about Gaetz on Thursday.
I mean, Matt Gaetz comes to mind, and I have concerns that he can't get across the finish line, and we're going to spend a lot of political capital. I say we. A lot of people will spend a lot of political capital on something that even if they got done, you'd have to wonder if it was worth it. He's got a really steep hill to climb to get lots of votes, including mine.
Senator Cramer says Donald Trump called him after he made those comments to personally urge him to support the man who the Ethics Committee had investigated for having sex with a minor. For what it's worth, Cramer says he is skeptical but open to the nomination. Maybe we'll learn some new things about the circumstances under which that investigation happened and the allegations at the center of it. I imagine we're going to hear a lot of language like that from Republican senators in the coming days and weeks. Trump has also pushed some of that vote-whipping work onto his second in command. The Financial Times reporting that J.D. Vance, a devout Catholic, man of God, is set to act as something of a Sherpa to guide Gates' expected nomination through the Senate, as well as that of Fox News Weekend host Pete Hegseth, who Trump wants to return to the Defense Department. There's a whole other story about Hegseth we won't get into now. Trump's co-president, Elon Musk, also helping out. He is out there comparing Gates favorably, I think, to Judge Dredd, a fictional character from a comic book set in a future American dystopia where democracy has been canceled and fascist so-called judges rule over the population and are permitted to act with near impunity as judge, jury, and executioner. That's the model that Elon Musk says Gates embodies and why he should be head of the Department of Justice. So far, it's unclear how effective this lobbying campaign has been. Some senators have said they're reserving judgment. They'd like to see the House Ethics Committee reporting to Gates. That committee, the House Ethics Committee, is set to meet tomorrow to discuss how to move forward with that report, which, again, is, as far as we can see, completed. It's a question of whether it gets released and how. Now, the probe was effectively shelved, or at least the release of the report was effectively shelved, when Gates abruptly resigned from Congress last week, which caught everyone by surprise. Now, there's certainly a case, I think, humbly, for the public to have access to the details in the report, nevertheless, including the witnesses who say they saw Matt Gaetz having sex with a minor. Just today, we learned that an apparent hacker gained access to sworn testimony from two women involved in a related civil case. We should note the hacked material has not been made public, but it's another reminder this information still exists out there. Some House Republicans really don't want that information to be made public. I don't know why, but Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia has even resorted to threatening members of her own party to that end. Quote, for my Republican colleagues in the House and Senate, if we are going to release ethics reports and rip apart our own that Trump has appointed, then put it all out there for the American people to see. Yes, all the ethics reports and claims, including the one I filed, all your sexual harassment and assault claims that were secretly settled, paying off victims with taxpayer money. The entire Jeffrey Epstein files, tapes, recordings, witness interviews, but not just those. There's more. Epstein isn't the only asset. If we're going to dance, Let's all dance in the sunlight. I'll make sure we do. Now, of course, there's some, grain of salt, consider the source, conspiratorial ruminations there. But, you know, if there's a lot of this going around the Republican members of Congress, I agree with Marjorie Taylor Greene. We should know about it. Now, the Congresswoman provided no evidence such reports exist, but we do know that the Gates ethics report exists. We do know, according to a lawyer for some women, that they testified about what he did. And if this man is going to not just have a job in the administration, run the Department of Justice, I think the American public deserves to see it.
You've reported on the risk that can happen in appointing too many inexperienced or sort of partisan brawlers to cabinet posts. My first question is simple. If Trump does get most of these people in, if there are fewer people to stand up patriotically to potentially illegal orders or radical ideas internally, then who do we look to be the guardrails in a second term?
Very important question. I remember interviewing Trump 8 years ago, long time ago, and asked him about power. And what Trump said was real power is, I don't even want to use the word, but real power is fear. That's one of Trump's techniques that he has always used, scaring people. And with these nominees who are clearly unqualified, I mean, it is a dimension of overreach and an effort to scare people, the system, not just Democrats, but Republicans, that is incredibly large. I don't think it will work, but presidents have extraordinary power, and he'll have it for 4 years, so we're going to have to wait. But overreaching, we see all the time in politics, and Trump is overreaching here in a very dramatic way, kind of, oh, yes, you know, I'm going to scare you. And I think lots of people are scared, but I think lots of people are just mobilized, not just Democrats, but some Republicans saying, wait a minute, this is a bridge, a nomination way too far.
Right, and what you're reminding everyone is that the coalitions, the intensity, the ardor are built on a range of different goals. Some people might enjoy the so-called show of Donald Trump. A lot of other people want results on the economy or immigration reform or other things. And that's hard to do if you're completely paralyzed and fixated on these cabinet issues. You say overreach. You may have seen this already. I want to play for the viewers, Bob, what Brit Hume, a longtime member of the media, Fox anchor, somewhat conservative, what he said on that point.
It's impressive, but whether it is a landslide producing a mandate is another matter. There's some counts now that say that, updated counts that say that he's slipped below 50% of the popular vote. So you have to be careful about these things. Real mandates are rare, and landslides are perhaps even rarer. The president would be wise to ignore the talk from his supporters about what an enormous mandate he has and what a great landslide he won.
That said, Britt,
thinking that can lead to trouble.
Brit Hume putting it straightforward, and we'll put up the chart to remind folks, Trump improved his position this year, and it was a comeback by any stretch of the political term. And in that sense, it was striking to many. Was it a mandate? Well, it's smaller than most recent elections, smaller than Biden. Clinton, as of tonight, had a larger total vote mandate or margin than he does. So where does history fit into this for him and what he should do?
These margins, you know, there are going to be debates and counts and recounts and rethinking. But the idea of putting people totally unqualified for important jobs, Justice Department, Defense Department, is the sort of self-destructive act, and it may not be intentional, but it's this Trump again who wants to frighten and scare people. That is a large pillar of his operational style. And too many Republicans are going to say, wait a minute, don't do this. Trump, what's he trying to do? I think in a way prove that he can be the imperial president. He's got all the power. He can do exactly what he wants. I think Republicans first and a larger system in confirmation process in the Senate will say no. And it will, at some point, if this becomes a real clash, a very dramatic no. You can't do this. You can't run government this way. You can't go when you've got to get your car fixed. You can't go to the grocery store for help. You have to go where it's needed and relevant. And that's, Republicans are saying this privately. I think they will say it out loud and very strongly. Don't defeat yourself in these initial moves.
In your previous book, which we've discussed on this program, Bob, you reported on and had many extensive conversations with Donald Trump during the pandemic. One of the things that came through was that at times he was more focused on what they call the narrative nowadays, what they used to call spin, than perhaps some of the fundamentals of what the government could do to address the crisis. Do you see any growth, learning, and change, or do you have the deeper concern looking at the initial cabinet appointments that he's not yet focused on picking the people who can actually do the work?
Well, I don't see growth. The last year 2020 of his first presidency, I did 9 hours of interviews with him. This was the year of COVID, and he wouldn't take the warnings that were handed to him on a silver platter and do the responsible thing to protect the citizens. And this was all taped with his permission. It's out there. People can listen to it or read it. And it is a moral felony what he did as president in not mobilizing to protect the people, doing something that in the discussions with him kept saying, what's the plan? What are you going to do? Oh, it's going to go away. Don't worry. Well, it didn't go away. 1.1 million people died in this country of the virus. He was warned early that year of 2020 when there was one case. And it would have been in his interest and the interest of the entire country to just let's have a plan, let's do something. Instead, he walked away from it. And that also is a pattern. And this idea of these nominees is truly, utterly off the charts. And what you wonder about is his wife, Melania, does he not have somebody in his inner circle who will just say, Mr. President-elect, or they still call him Mr. President, let's count to 10 on this, and let's have a strategy that has an end point that's success, rather than a kind of accentuating the divisions in this country. He's got an opportunity. A president-elect always has an opportunity. One of the things in writing about many, many presidents for 50 years is the goodwill of the public falls on the president-elect in a way that it's very important that the president-elect understand that goodwill, and it can be mobilized, can be used to help the president fulfill his goals. But if he's just going to throw sand in the eyes of his own party and rationality, he's He's going to defeat himself in a way. I mean, I look at some of these people who are being put up, and there are so many people, like the current defense secretary, Lloyd Austin, somebody who has had so much experience in combat, 1-star level, 2-star level, 3-star level, 4-star level, Secretary of Defense who has, by accounts of people down in the ranks, people in the Biden White House National Security Team, done a fabulous job. Well, I don't know whether he's a Republican or a Democrat, but somebody like that can be used to help any president.
The president-elect spoke out this week, about journalism. We just touched in the earlier segment how you've dealt with him, reported with him, but also ended up in lawsuits with him. We all know what he's like. He said he'll give a third chance, but not a fourth. He said he, quote, doesn't want to destroy people's lives in the press. And he's also publicly talked about retribution, as you saw just there, against people who've investigated him or his allies. How should journalists and the society that we are in approach this? How should we be fair, not baited into being positioned on a team or quote-unquote enemy of an administration when that's not what journalism is supposed to be, without also being asleep at the wheel when we have to cover what people say they're going to do? How do we do it?
We do it with the standard methods of very aggressive, fair-minded reporting. But there are so many things that are just hidden that don't come out. A couple of years ago, Putin was threatening in a very serious way to use a tactical nuclear weapon. How was this stopped? The Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, who has lots of experience, the White House, NSC, CIA, top intelligence person, was able to explain to President Biden, because Biden asked, who has influence with Putin? Turns out the person who has influence with potential influence with Putin is the Chinese President Xi.
Well, I just think we have to do a really thorough job of vetting Tulsi Gabbard and asking some very difficult questions. Obviously, we have all watched her toe the line of some brutal, despotic regimes, defending Moscow's invasion of Ukraine, engaging in secret diplomacy with Bashar al-Assad in the middle of his murderous rampage inside Syria. I just think we have to ask some real questions about Tulsi Gabbard's positions.
Hi again, everybody. 5 o'clock in New York. At a time when global tensions are high and the war in Ukraine is intensifying, Donald Trump's decision to tap Tulsi Gabbard as his incoming director of national intelligence is raising alarms, as you heard there. New reporting uncovers how she has become a favorite among the state media of one of America's adversaries, Russia. That's according to the New York Times, which reports this, quote, in Russia, the reaction to her potential appointment has been gleeful, even if Putin's government remains wary of American policies, even under a second Trump administration. Quote, the CIA and the FBI are trembling, a Russian newspaper wrote on Friday in a glowing profile of Ms. Gabbard, noting positively that Ukrainians consider her, quote, an agent of the Russian state. A state television channel called her a Russian comrade in Mr. Trump's emerging cabinet. The Times goes on to report, quote, among members from both parties, her tacit support of Russia's war aims in Ukraine and her repetition of Kremlin disinformation have raised doubts about whether she should be given oversight of the intelligence agencies, including the responsibility of preparing the highly classified daily intelligence briefings for the returning president, which we have just learned Trump is now receiving as the president-elect after having chosen not to receive them while he was a candidate. Trump receiving intelligence briefings is remarkable for the fact that just last year he was criminally charged for mishandling national defense information and classified information. His already established disregard for the safety of our nation's secrets. makes his cabinet choices, especially those with access to top intelligence, all the more serious. Here's Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger.
So I'm a former CIA officer. I worked undercover for my time with the agency as a case officer. The reason that this nomination, I think, is so dangerous is because any damage that she would do, any information she would provide the president, right? She tweets Russian propaganda. Why not include it in the presidential daily brief? She traffics in conspiracy theories. Why not kind of push that into the greater ecosystem of intelligence? And none of that would ever be seen by the public. There's no opportunity to push back. There's no opportunity to understand. It's not about party or the president-elect. It's about our national security.
That is where we start the hour with some of our favorite experts and friends. Former CIA director and MSNBC senior national security analyst John Brennan's here. Also joining us, former assistant director for counterintelligence at the FBI, MSNBC national security analyst Frank Figliuzzi is back, and the president of Media Matters, Angelo Carusone, is here. Director Brennan, let me just bring into the conversation before we start some new reporting in the Washington Post about the transition, which is what's happening right now. The Washington Post today reports this, quote, Trump has yet to collaborate with the General Services Administration, which is tasked with the complex work of handing over control of hundreds of agencies, because he has not turned in required pledges to follow ethics rules. His transition teams have yet to set foot inside a single federal office. In calls with foreign heads of state, Trump has cut out the State Department, its secure lines, and its official interpreters. So Trump is right now, what, a black box to the intelligence agencies he's about to oversee?
Well, I think Donald Trump is a well-known commodity in terms of what he did during his first term and also how he recklessly handled classified information, which I think is one of the reasons why there is such concern within the intelligence communities. But, I mean, let's face it, Donald Trump is not going to follow any rules but his own. That's why there have been no individuals that have been submitted for background checks to the FBI. These ethics pledges have not been signed. As you point out, GSA has not been able to engage with them in order to ensure this transition is smooth and seamless. But then also with his appointees, I think he's just showing that he is going to do whatever he wants, and he's basically daring Republicans, especially in the Senate, to defy him. So given that the Director of National Intelligence is, by law, the president's principal intelligence advisor, the individual who oversees the production of the President's Daily Brief, which contains the secrets and sensitive classified information of the U.S. intelligence community, this is a tremendous responsibility that is now being entrusted, at least in the nomination of Tulsi Gabbard. And it's clear, based on what Senator Murphy said at New York Times and Congresswoman Spanberger, she has done things and said things over the years that really cause great concern about where her sympathies and sentiments lie. But also, she has no experience or background in the intelligence profession. I mean, yes, she served in the U.S. military for 20 years. She should be thanked for that. But she has none of the experience or the credentials that are necessary to lead 18 intelligence agencies departments when we're facing so many challenges around the globe. And so, therefore, again, Donald Trump is just going to, I think, ramrod these selections through. And it's really going to be up to the Republicans in the Senate to be able to stop him.
Director Brennan, can you just say a little bit about what happens on day one for the workforce of, say, the CIA?
Well, they on noon on January 20th, when Donald Trump is inaugurated, they then will going to be following the direction of whoever is in charge of the agency. And so John Ratcliffe has been nominated, but he's not, I don't know if he's going to be confirmed soon after that. But Donald Trump has the ability to appoint an acting director. The deputy director of the CIA is not a Senate-confirmed position. So that acting director can actually carry out all those duties and responsibilities. And so that person can send, I think, some shocking directions to the CIA officers who, again, put their lives on the line around the globe 24/7. And so I think that there's, great worry and concern about what does this mean, given that Donald Trump has said he's basically going to blow up the administrative state and do some slashing and burning. And these are the institutions that we rely on so heavily for our national security. And what I don't want my former colleagues to do is to leave the agency, because we need them to stay strong and to carry out their responsibilities with the solemnity that they have over the course of, I think, the CIA's history.
Frank, let me read a little bit more of NBC's reporting on how this would work. Gabbard would pose a potentially unprecedented dilemma for U.S. intelligence agencies, a top official who may not share an underlying premise about which countries are America's major enemies. The DNI's job is to define the world as it is, as opposed to advocating for a world as you want it to be. That's a former intelligence official. Former U.S. intelligence officials and lawmakers also worry that Gabbard and the new Trump administration might decide to scale back intelligence sharing with Ukraine, possibly in an attempt to force Kyiv to agree to a peace deal. Your thoughts?
Yeah, indeed. The job of a DNI is to coordinate the intelligence community, everybody rowing in the direction of finding the facts that best support U.S. interests. And if the person in charge of that is biased and wants everybody rowing over here away from fact and truth and U.S. interests, she has the ability to do that. She sets the shopping list, so to speak, for collection across the U.S. intelligence community. And as John has just said, she'll also decide what goes in that daily brief to the president. And if the president doesn't want to hear anything about Russia, then guess what? She's going to say, I don't want that in the briefing. He's not going to hear that. That's bad news for him. That's not what U.S. intelligence collection is supposed to be. And I know a lot of people are talking about the threat and risk she poses because of her positions, her travels, and all of that. But it's even worse than that. We can't stand here and say with any certainty that she is a Russian asset or she poses a threat or risk, because we're not being allowed to view or engage in the standard FBI background investigation that is supposed to happen with this level of nominees. So that means the Senate is flying blind and may even lose their advice and consent powers, which are in the Constitution, if Trump goes the route of recess appointments. That means the Senate Judiciary Committee is not getting what they're supposed to have. And it means that the American public doesn't know who's taking one of the most important positions in the intelligence community. No background investigation, no GSA process. What does that mean? Is Trump afraid that GSA office space would be bugged? Is that where we are right now? Or he doesn't simply want to have to sign that ethics agreement? That's where we are. We don't even know who these people are because we're deprived of the background investigations. And who gives these people a clearance, by the way? DNI's got every clearance known to man, right? Who says, yeah, you get the clearance despite the lack of any background investigation?